Today is October 28, 2017, and we're going to continue our discussion of logical fallacies and all of that sort of thing. Before we start, let's ask our Heavenly Family to guide us. Heavenly Family, we're really grateful for the opportunity to learn how to think and for the chance to be corrected and to give up our faulty ways of thinking. Please help us to advance in this area so that we can rightly represent who you are and not present your message alongside logical fallacies, and also help us to recognize the various beliefs that we may hold which rest upon nothing but logical fallacies, so that we can give them up as well. So we're ready for you to teach us. Please guide us. Thank you so much. We ask this in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
So, first, I just wanted to ask you guys if anyone has any general comments or questions on what we have discussed in past meetings on logical fallacies and anything kind of related to that topic. And if you don't have anything and you're just ready to get into some more of these logical fallacies, just say you're ready.
We're ready.
Ready.
Okay. So, I think we'll start with two logical fallacies that are somewhat related. One is called wishful thinking, and the other one is called appeal to consequences. Now, they are distinct to some extent, but there is some overlap, and a lot of the time when someone commits an appeal to consequences fallacy, they're also committing a wishful thinking fallacy, and vice versa. So first, let's define these two fallacies. So wishful thinking is a specific type of appeal to emotion where a decision is made according to what might be pleasing to imagine rather than according to evidence or reason. And then appeal to consequences is the conclusion is supported by a premise that asserts positive or negative consequences from some course of action in an attempt to distract from the initial discussion. Okay, so at first those sound pretty different, and like I said, there are differences between them, but there's certainly some overlap. So kind of the difference is this. Wishful thinking may have nothing to do with a consequence. It may not be, oh, well, if that's true, then there's some negative consequence, like some sort of future effect or something like that. Wishful thinking may just simply be that you don't want something to be true, and so you conclude that it is not true, even if that doesn't have to do specifically with consequences, whereas appeal to consequences always has to do with consequences. So again, wishful thinking may or may not have to do with consequences, whereas appeal to consequences always has to do with consequences. So we'll go through some examples of wishful thinking first, and then we'll look at appeal to consequences. And while we're going through wishful thinking, you may notice that some of them do relate to consequences, but it's still an example of wishful thinking. So first, someone might say, I know I will win the lottery. I'm lucky. Well, that's just wishful thinking. Someone just thinks that, oh yeah, I have good luck on this. I'm totally going to win this, without actually having any logical reasoning for it, just simply liking the idea that they're going to win it. So that's kind of a quote-unquote positive example. A negative example would be something like this. Human-caused global warming can't be real. I just can't handle having to make a bunch of changes right now. So someone wishes that they don't have to change their lifestyle to accommodate the impact of human-caused global warming, and so they conclude that it must not be real. So again, that's wishful thinking. Here are two other examples. These two are from that Logically Fallacious website. So the first one is, I know in my heart of hearts that our home team will win the World Series. Well, that's just wishing that they win the World Series. It's just hoping that they will. And because you really hope it, you believe that it will happen. Oh, that's simply wishful thinking. It's no evidence. It's not a logically held belief or an evidence-based belief. It's merely wishful thinking, which is, again, a logical fallacy. Just because you wish something to be true does not mean that it is. The second example from the aforementioned website is, I believe that when we die, we are all given new, young, perfect bodies, and we spend eternity with those whom we love. I can't imagine the point of life if it all just ends when we die. Okay, so that sort of thing, you hear people say that sort of thing a lot, where there's a belief that is comforting to them, and the reason that they give for believing it is that it's comforting to them. Or let's say someone believes that when you die you go to heaven, and let's say you hear someone relating that their recently deceased loved one is now in heaven, and you ask them, well, why do you believe that? And they might reply by saying something like, well, it really is so comforting for me to know that they're there and they're looking down on me and that they're in a better place and that they're not suffering or anything like that. People do actually give those sorts of answers when asked why they believe something. And obviously it's not an actual valid reason to conclude that someone is conscious after dying, but it is at least an honest response as to why they believe it. But of course the reason is fallacious. Maybe sincere, it may be genuinely held, but it is fallacious nonetheless. So a very similar example to this is, if there were no life after death, then this life would be rather meaningless. And so I choose to believe we have an eternal soul. So that's an instance of people just preferring one belief over another, and so they go with the belief that they prefer. And when it comes to kind of like final end type subjects and what happens when you die and that sort of thing, this logical fallacy is employed quite frequently because people just don't want to believe certain things, and because they think that something is undesirable, like believing that when you're dead, you're just dead, and they think the other belief is better because they like it better, well, they'll use that as a reason for believing what they perceive to be the better belief. So here's another example of that. I do not believe in reincarnation because I would not like to come back as someone or something else. So that's someone just saying, well, I don't want to believe that I'm going to come back as someone else or something else, so no, I don't believe reincarnation. Just because you don't like it doesn't mean it's not true. To be clear, I'm not saying reincarnation is true. I'm just saying that that's a bad reason for saying that it is not true. It's simply wishful thinking. And that's also appeal to consequence. You know, oh, well, if that's true, then this would happen. And I don't like that consequence, therefore it's not true. So another instance of wishful thinking, and this one I've heard someone said this to me, the Pentecostal church must be the right one. I know that God led me here. So someone has the thought or belief, or they wish to believe that God led them there, so it must be the right one. Again, it's not stating any actual reason. It's just the fact that they ended up becoming a Christian into that church makes them think that, they like to think that, well, God wouldn't have led me to the wrong place, so therefore this must be the right place. Again, wishful thinking. Now, this one might be a little bit more relevant for people in this message when we are unlearning many things. There might be certain things that you might not want to unlearn, and you hope that certain things that you have traditionally believed must be true. So you might say, oh, well, maybe, some of these writings, some of the books in the 66 books of the Protestant canon, maybe they might not be inspired, but the Gospel of John has to be inspired. It's my favorite gospel. Again, that's just wishful thinking. We just really hope that this one is right, and so we conclude that it must be. Now, that would simply be wishful thinking. Or maybe not in regard to a writing, maybe in regard to a certain story or event or miracle. Like we might say, well, the miracle of walking on water must be true. It has touched my heart and had a personal impact on me. Okay, so we are emotionally attached to that particular story, and so we wish it to be true, and thus we believe that it's true. That's not a good reason to believe something. It's fallacious. It's wishful thinking. We might also have other stories like, the story of David and Goliath, or the flood, or the Exodus, or whatever other story you can imagine. Just think of your favorite Bible stories. Those are the ones which you might be prone to think, well, that must be true, or you might really hope that it's true and just believe that it's true because you don't like the thought of it not being true. But of course, whether the story is true or false, how much you might wish for it to be true has nothing to do with whether or not it actually is. So here's another example. So someone might say, all those people who talk about logic and science are just fooling themselves that they are smarter than the rest of us. But really, they have no real intelligence in the practical world. Okay, so that sort of thing might be a less obvious example, but it is. It may include other logical fallacies as well, but it at least includes some element of wishful thinking. And it's very common. Like, there is kind of a thread of anti-intellectualism within the Western world. And very often, university, science, logic, critical thinking, all of that is spoken against, and people are kind of accused of, or I'll put it like this, people often think that all of those things, education in higher institutions or universities or anything like that, that's all brainwashing, or it really just tricks people and fools people into believing different things, and really they're just believing dogma. People like to believe that because they don't want to think that those things may in fact be legitimate. And so it's a form of wishful thinking. It's a conglomeration of things, actually. There's an element of ad hominem, where we're actually attacking the opposite position. There's an element of wishful thinking. And then there's also projection that takes place a lot. So often people of faith, so to speak, religious people, will accuse people without faith of having faith. Oh, well, everyone has faith. What you believe is just based on faith too. Well, there's an element of wishful thinking there. We don't want to think that maybe the other people actually have good reason for believing what they believe. We don't like that thought. We do not wish that to be true. In fact, we wish it not to be true. And so we end up projecting something onto the other side. And again, that's all fallacious. So we need to be careful not to do that, because I know, most of us being raised as people of faith or having been converted into a religious system, it's common in many religious systems to have this kind of anti-intellectual view and to project onto others, oh, well, yeah, they just believe that on faith, or, oh, they just, you don't have a good reason either, that sort of thing. And often that's because deep down we know that we just believe what we believe without good reason, and so we don't like the idea that others have better reasons for their beliefs or lack of beliefs than we do. So we paint it as though we're all on the same ground, and that may not be the case. So we'll look now at appeal to consequences, and you'll see some of these are very similar to wishful thinking and have elements of wishful thinking in them. So, someone might say, belief in the theory of evolution leads to eugenics, therefore the theory of evolution is false. I forget which website I got that from, but this one and the next one are from someplace online. And you can see that it's looking at a consequence or a perceived consequence, and so therefore it must be false. That belief leads to that, therefore it must be false. It's also similar to the slippery slope thing. It's just that with the slippery slope fallacy, there are multiple steps leading to a certain conclusion, and often it is really unrealistic, the idea that it would actually lead there. Whereas with appeal to consequences, it may just be an immediate consequence without a whole chain of events leading up to something, and it may be that the consequence is actually a real consequence. Maybe this believing in something will actually lead to something else. But the fact is that even if it has a negative consequence, it doesn't mean that it's not true. The next example, belief in God leads to an increase in charitable giving. Therefore, God exists. Okay, so that's the positive side. Well, believing in this leads to this good result. Therefore, this belief is true. Well, you know what? Belief in God has led to a lot of charitable giving. There are a lot of people who, because of their belief in God, end up doing good things. But that doesn't mean that the belief is true. Plus, the other problem with that is that it really limits the scope of things. Which God are we talking about? A lot of people believe in different gods, and their belief in different gods leads them to do good things. That doesn't mean that the belief in any one God is true because it leads someone to do something good. So again, that's appeal to consequence fallacy. So here is another example. And these next two examples both deal with morality. So one's positive, one is negative. If there is objective morality, then good moral behavior will be rewarded after death. I don't know about you, but I won't be robbed of my reward. Therefore, morality must be objective. And seriously, guys, if you watch debates online about morality, between, let's say, Christians and atheists, often Christians will believe that morality is objective, and atheists or non-believers will believe that it is not objective. And often Christians will make arguments like this. They'll say things like, well, if morality isn't objective, then those who do good will just end up dying, and then it'll be over, and they won't ever get their reward. As if that has something to do with whether morality really is objective or not. And the reverse of that is the next example. If there is no objective morality, then all the bad people will not be punished for their bad behavior after death. I don't like that. Therefore, morality must be objective. Now, people don't state it in such a formulated way, but in debates on morality, people do end up making that argument. People will end up making the argument that, oh, so you're saying that there is no real objective morality? Well, then someone's going to go and do all of these horrible things and then just die, and they'll never receive their just punishment. But I believe in objective morality, and I believe that God establishes morality, and He, being a moral God, will make sure that the right rewards or punishments take place. Okay, well, again, that's just appeal to consequence. You like the consequences of people who do bad things reaping their bad reward, and people who do good things reaping their good reward. But that has nothing to do with whether or not the belief in objective or non-objective morality is true. So in this example, it's easy to see the wishful thinking coming in as well. Someone wishes that their particular belief is true because they like it more. So they like the consequence more, and therefore they go with that. Another example. Free will must exist. If it didn't, we would all be machines. Okay, well, I'm sure you guys have heard something like that as well. People arguing that free will must be true because otherwise we're all just machines. But just because we don't like the idea of being machines doesn't mean that we're not machines. Again, I'm not saying that we are machines, but arguing that free will must be real for the reason that if it isn't, we're just machines, is a horrible argument. It's wishful thinking, and it's appeal to consequences. Two other examples also found online. At least the second one I think is from Rational Wiki. Maybe both are, I'm not remembering. So, someone may say, evolution must be false. If it were true, then human beings would be no better than animals, since we would be descended from them. Okay, so again, whether or not evolution is true, arguing that it must be false because if it's true we'd be no better than animals isn't a good argument. That's just saying you don't like the implication and therefore you don't want to believe it. That does not make sense. Now this next one is from Rational Wiki, And this, I've heard this particular fallacy a lot. It also has to do with evolution. And it's from a guy named Sung Young Moon. And he's the leader of a religious group often called the Moonies. He said, some zoologists are saying the monkey is ancestor of the human. Then ask the scholar, sir, who is your grandfather? Is he a monkey? Then you are a descendant of a monkey. Will he like that? No way. It will turn him off. Would you like a monkey to be your grandfather? So I've heard the same sort of thing from people like Kent Hovind and Ken Ham, who are two of the most famous creationists. And, they've said practically this exact same thing. Like, oh, would you want your grandfather or your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather to be a monkey or a rock or a whatever? And it's just saying, oh, I don't like the implication of this belief or the consequence of this belief, therefore it can't be true. Again, whether you like it or not has no bearing on whether or not it is true. So those sorts of arguments are, again, wishful thinking and also appeal to consequences, both entirely fallacious. Another example of this. I just don't believe that my friend lied to me because if she did, our friendship would be over and I'm not ready for it to be over. Well, people can say that sort of thing a lot. But just because you don't want to believe something because you're not ready for the consequences does not have a bearing on whether or not it is true. So another instance of that is, if I profess the branch message, I will lose my friends. Therefore, I shouldn't believe it is true, or I shouldn't profess it to be true. Well, just because there are consequences that we do not like, does that mean that we shouldn't do something or shouldn't believe something? No, again, that's appeal to consequences. So people often commit logical fallacies in reasoning with themselves as to what they should do and not do. And so, yeah, it's pretty important that we examine ourselves to make sure we are not committing logical fallacies in formulating our beliefs or in determining our actions or anything else. So that's it for those two fallacies, again, wishful thinking and appeal to consequences. I know that usually I go through one and then we go through questions and comments, but because these two are so linked, I wanted to go through them together. So are there any comments or questions on this fallacy or these two fallacies? All right, we'll go to the next one then. The next fallacy is appeal to fear, which is a specific type of appeal to emotion where an argument is made by increasing fear and prejudice towards the opposing side. So, a couple examples. If we don't bail out the big automakers, the U.S. economy will collapse. Therefore, we need to bail out the automakers. Okay, so that's bringing in this element of fear. Well, if we don't do this, this horrible thing will happen. Therefore, we need to do this. Now, I will say, though, that there are instances where an action does lead to a real consequence, and pointing that out, even if it is something where someone is going to be afraid, is not necessarily committing the logical fallacy, because it may just be the reality of things that unless a certain thing happens, some horrible result will come about. And people understanding that may be very helpful for them. It may be a warning. But if you bring up the horrible result in order to induce fear into people so that they will end up believing something or acting in a certain way, then that is appeal to fear, and it is a manipulative argument that has no rational basis. So let's look at another example. So Timmy says, "Mom, what if I don't believe in God?" Mom says, "Then you'll burn in hell forever. Why do you ask?" Timmy says, "No reason." Okay, so that's instilling fear, and it's just holding someone in a belief because, well, if you don't continue in that belief, then you're going to burn in hell forever. So that's the same thing. Now, I will say that, of course, a mother could say that to her child, fully believing that is the reality of what will happen. And so, a mother may be saying that because she believes that it's an important warning to be sounded. But it's not like the fear of burning in hell forever is a good reason to continue believing in God. So, again, while there may be times where it's important to point out a very real and perhaps fearful consequence, it is important for people to point it out in such a way that does not put pressure on the other person to feel as though they need to believe or act based on that fear. So, another example, a commercial for a political candidate that argues that his opponent's support of amnesty for illegal immigrants will open our country to terrorism. And, people can play it in such a way that it's just instilling fear in others. Or a commercial for a security company that shows someone breaking into a home in the middle of the night. And when it comes to videos, appeal to fear can be really accentuated. And there's an anti-Rod video called Unmasking the Wolf. There's a trailer for it online, and it is so full of the appeal to fear fallacy. And, the whole thing, it has this, scary music and, Victor Hoddef and the shepherd's rod, and it's all spoken of as so scary. And then at the end, the title comes on the screen, Unmasking the Wolf, and it's just silent. And then just before the video ends, there's this pause, and just before the video ends, there's a wolf that just roar, and it's just scary, And it's really, really strongly appealing to fear because the producers of that video want people to be afraid of the shepherd's rod so that they won't study it and believe it. Now that's just, again, committing a logical fallacy. It's subtly using this argument, which is the logical fallacy appeal to fear. It's really sending the message, even though it's not stating it in so many words, but it's sending the message that you shouldn't study this or investigate it or look at it or believe it because it's scary, it's evil. So, another example. A parent says to a child, "You better clean your room because if you don't, you'll get a spanking." So that's not really a good reason for a child to clean their room. If a parent is going to say, "You should clean your room because," they should then explain why it's important to keep rooms clean, rather than saying, because if you don't, you'll be punished. That's appeal to fear. Here's another example. If you do not get rid of your acupuncture charts, demons will fill your home. Okay, so that's another instance of appeal to fear, like telling someone, oh, well, if you don't get rid of this, then this is going to happen, some awful thing. Really, any form of blackmail is appeal to fear. Are there any comments or questions on this fallacy?
We were just watching a video today that was posted by a Seventh-day Adventist friend of ours, basically on Kenneth Copeland and the Pope. We were studying Shepherd's Rod Volume 2 and the Parade of Beasts and just the wound being healed and why it was healed in 1929, basically because Protestantism had dropped the ball. We were watching this video it's a Seventh-day Adventist video of Kenneth Copeland and him talking about the papacy, which was kind of backing up what Victor Hadoff was kind of saying prophetically a little bit. But all the heads are basically forming this federation was the point of it. But there was this really creepy music. So it was a Seventh-day Adventist production, but they were using this creepy, scary music, was superimposed over the top of it. And we were all recognizing how, I wish that creepy music wasn't there, because it does kind of mess you up a little bit. Like you don't even need the creepy music. We should just not be affected by that. We should just be listening to what Kenneth Copeland is saying and just judge it on that. But of course, we didn't like that they were superimposing creepy music over the top of it. Although we did find that what the words were saying were creepy on their own, but still it was, they were definitely appealing to fear, and we felt that was wrong.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent example. Music is definitely used along those lines, because really appeal to fear is a subcategory of a broader logical fallacy, which is appeal to emotion, which includes appeal to fear and many other things. But to kind of give another example of appeal to emotion are altar calls. Or I should say the way most altar calls are done, where an evangelist or a preacher will give this, sermon, and at the end, the music will start playing, and it's very, emotionally evocative and can really cause people to want to start crying or make a commitment or something, and then not only the music, but the rhetorical style of saying things like, if your heart was touched today. You notice how I'm moving my voice, right? If your heart was touched today, pause. And you just leave that pause there, and then wait for someone to gain their anticipation, and then you bring in another kind of prompting or urging type of thing. And I can't really do it fully because I've never practiced this, because I never went to seminary. But in seminary they practice these things and learn how to make these appeals where you just you're not really appealing to someone's reason. You're appealing to their emotion, and you're making it dramatic, and you're pausing at specific times and saying things in a certain way. And I'm sure everyone has noticed how most preachers sound the same. They sound a certain way. It's because they all learn this rhetorical style, which they might think is effective communication, but it's really the purpose of these rhetorical styles is to really capture someone's emotions and have an emotional impact on them. So I was never really comfortable with altar calls even as a young kid, because it just seemed like it was just drawing you in emotionally. And even then I recognized that it wasn't appealing to reason. It wasn't trying to get people to make an informed decision based on actual information. It was just appealing to emotion. And so that, I believe, is so very wrong. So anyway, any other comments or questions?
Trent, I was just going to say, I'm glad you did an awful job doing it. Trying to sound like it.
Yeah, I can't do it. I'd be a horrible preacher.
Yeah. Anyway, and yeah, same sentiments. The altar calls were just not appealing to me when they used to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a question too. When Ben Roden, when he was appealing to Adventists and branches, Davidians or whoever, when he was appealing for them to move to Israel back then, there was no such thing as, there was no statement saying, okay, if you don't come now in the time of peace, you're going to have to go in the time of trouble. Was there?
Well, yeah, there definitely was. But again, that's not an appeal to fear, because it wasn't trying to evoke fear. Like, in order to even evoke fear, you have to have people thinking that what you're saying is even going to happen. But they didn't even believe in the kingdom or anything like that. What he did is try to show them a practical reason for going to Israel. He was trying to show how, look, we know that before the international Sunday laws, there are going to be national Sunday laws. But that's here in the Assyrian domain, so to speak. He didn't use those terms when talking to Seventh-day Adventists, at least. When talking to Davidians, yes, but in the United States and so on, this is where it's going to happen first, not in the land of Israel. So let's go to Israel, because there, Sabbath observance is actually just part of how everything's done in the nation, and they won't be having these national Sunday laws while they're happening in the United States. And so he was saying, hey, look, now's a time of peace, and it makes sense to go there, so let's go there now. And then he quoted the passage from Isaiah 30, which talked about how, hey, in returning and rest shall be, or however it puts it, in quietness and rest shall be the return, or whatever. And he said, hey, this is our opportunity right now. So it was actually not a fear thing. He was actually giving them a comfort by saying, hey, you can come now. And then the next verse in Isaiah 30 shows that, it says, but they say, no, we will go in a time of war, and so on and so forth. So, he basically was saying, look, right now, while it's a time of peace, let's go. He wasn't appealing to their emotions or appealing to fear. It's quite clear in reading his articles that he was appealing to reason, because he's saying, look, you already know that you can't function as you presently are if the mark of the beast system is in place. So let's do what's practical to do now. So, anyway.
Great, thanks.
Any other comments or questions?
Just on that Ben note, too, we were just studying this today, too, that Victor Hoddef said about the scarlet-colored beast, that in Revelation 17:3, so he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and he points out how the wilderness is not the vineyard, so it's not going to be, the beast isn't going to affect Israel, basically, which, I'm sure Ben appealed to that statement from Victor Hoddef, too. Just interesting.
Certainly.
I have a question. So for appealing to fear, I see some preachers, some pastors when they preach, they yell. They were like yelling and preaching, the tone kind of yelling. So is that kind of appeal to fear?
Yeah, it sometimes is appeal to fear, depending on what they're yelling about and the context of their yelling. If they're yelling about hellfire and brimstone and all of that, or I have even seen an Adventist pastor yelling about the shepherd's rod, and it was in a way that was an appeal to fear. But it's not always an appeal to fear when pastors yell. Sometimes it's appeals to other emotions, and sometimes it's just trying to get people really riled up with excitement. And sometimes I'm not sure, I'd have to look up whether appeal to excitement is the title of a logical fallacy, but sometimes it's just that. It's just wanting to get people really excited about something, and kind of like to build up a frenzy. And, you know, that happens sometimes in churches where there'll be a lot of yelling, and sometimes it'll be yelling hallelujahs or something like that. But, yeah, sometimes it's just a very strong emotional appeal, either for fear or excitement or something else.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, so we'll go on to the next fallacy, and this one will be the last one for tonight. And this is perhaps, or I'll say it's at least one of the most well-known fallacies, and it is ad hominem, which means to the man or to the person. And it is where someone directs attention to the person making an argument or promoting a belief or making a claim, and looking at what the person has said or done or their characteristics in order to evaluate whether or not what they claim is true. Or simply just to say someone is wrong because of something bad about them, or someone is right because of something good about them. Or you might say that someone has motives to do something or to say something like, oh, you only hold this belief because you're like this or you're like that. All of those are forms of ad hominem arguments. Usually people think of ad hominem in the negative sense, where someone is saying that, you know, something is false because of someone's character. So they attack the character instead of the argument, or attack the person instead of the argument the person is making. But it does also include praising the person in order to say that their ideas are true. So here are some examples that I found online. And this one, I was just looking up some examples just before the meeting. I'm sure that if there had been a bit more time, I would have come across many more examples. This is one which, you know, none of you should have a problem finding examples of this fallacy. So here are some that I found online. So attacking someone's own sexual orientation in arguing about the right of LGBT individuals to marry. So someone may say, the only reason you could possibly be in favor of this is because you are not being honest about your own sexuality. So kind of saying, oh, well, if you're in favor of the legality of gay marriage, then you must be gay yourself, even if the person is married and has kids or whatever. Someone might argue that, insinuating something about their sexuality. So that's just attacking the person rather than the actual issues at hand rather than addressing the facts to be dealt with in discussing such an issue. Okay, another one. All these that I'm about to go through are online, ones that I found online until I say otherwise. So another instance is stating that one's age precludes him from being able to make an intelligent or meaningful argument. You're clearly just too young to understand. So people sometimes use those sorts of arguments. Use of marital status to invalidate an opinion of someone of a different status. How can you make a decision about someone having marital problems if you've never been married yourself? People say these sorts of things, and it's really a form of ad hominem. You're basically attacking someone's personal circumstances, their own status, in order to invalidate what they are saying, when really what they are saying needs to be judged on its own right. This happens also when it comes to children, or parenting, I should say. People will often view the advice of someone who has no children as being invalid simply because they have no children themselves, rather than evaluating the advice on its own merits, which is really what needs to be done. Another issue is nationality. Like you could say, oh, well, you couldn't possibly have anything good to say on this issue or anything valuable to say because, you're not a whatever the nationality is. Oh, you're not a Canadian, you couldn't possibly understand. This is a Canadian issue. What you have to say on this, isn't even worth considering. That would be foolish. Because, again, it's not evaluating what is even being said. It's just brushing it off because of the person who said it not being of a particular status. Or gender issues. Using a gender as a means to devalue an argument of an opposing gender. So, example, this is a female issue. As a man, how can you have an opinion about this? Okay, so again, that's just the ad hominem fallacy. It's attacking the person making the statement, not because of the statement, but you're just attacking them because of their status, whether their sexual status or whatever, rather than evaluating what they actually have to say. There are tons of examples of this. This is all that I had from online. So let's think of some other examples. One that comes to mind, which is very similar to one that we went through last night, is Ellen White was such a good person. Therefore, her teachings must be true. Again, that's to the person. You're judging the claims of the person based on the person, rather than judging the claims on their own merits. You could say, oh, well, David Koresh had illegal weapons and sexually abused children, therefore his teachings were wrong. Well, that is bad reasoning. And again, whether David Koresh was a true or false prophet is aside from the issue. And I should repeat this here now, in case anyone listening to this later does not know our positions, but we do not believe that David Koresh was a true prophet. To the contrary, we believe that he was a false prophet. But we don't believe that his claims were false because of anything he did. What he did was awful on its own right and is to be condemned on its own right. But then also what he said, his unique claims, were false because they do not comport with reality. Not because of what he did. His claims are false on their own right. And that's really the only reason to say that someone's claims are false is if they really are false on their own, not because of anything having to do with the person. So I'm sure I can think of more examples, but how about you guys think of some examples? What examples can you think of an ad hominem argument?
Well, Lois Roden got a massive ad hominem attack at our church in Michigan, as you know.
Yeah, absolutely. So attacking her character, saying, oh, she did this and she did that, and so on and so forth. Therefore, her teachings must be false, and she's a false prophet. Yeah. Anyone else? Can you guys think of other examples?
That a person's teaching is false because they have long hair?
How did I suspect that you were going to give that example? But yeah, that's totally an example.
Or that a person's teaching is false because they didn't actually go to seminary, they're not a pastor, something like that.
Yeah, that's a good example too.
Politicians do a lot of that, saying he's not qualified, he's never held an office, so therefore he can't be the mayor or whatever, or they'll make attacks on their past history, meaning that they wouldn't make a good mayor or whatever the political position is.
Certainly. Anything else from anyone?
There's actually lots of them. Too young, too old, male, female, whatever.
Yeah, it's kind of the whole categorization and dehumanization thing, So if someone says, oh, well, you can't believe what that guy says, he's a Muslim. Okay, so you are attacking someone because of their religious belief and saying that they must be false because of that. So you could attack someone for what they did, for what they said, for where they are from, for their age, their gender, their eye color, their skin color, whatever it may be. Like, it's really, there could be probably millions of examples of this where someone might attack a position by attacking the person who stated the position. So I think that's the important principle for us to get from this, that whether a idea is correct or not has nothing to do with any of the characteristics of the person presenting the idea. It has a lot more, it really just has to do with the idea itself. So, and actually for a moment, I want to go back to one of the things that Ed said, because it could be taken in different ways. So it might be the case, like, okay, if someone running for a political office, the fact that someone has no experience for that office in and of itself does, pointing that out does not necessarily qualify as an ad hominem argument. If it is true that they are unqualified, politics is one of those things where people might tend to think that there are exceptions, but, you would want a qualified mechanic or a qualified dentist or surgeon or whatever. You want someone who's actually qualified. And so if someone has no experience for an important position, it's not an ad hominem to point that out. However, if you then say that, well, this person's ideas are not valid, their political ideas are not valid because they have no political experience, that's not necessarily true. So if when you're discussing someone's qualifications, you're dealing with their experience, that's okay. You're dealing in the same ballpark. But if you then extend that to their ideas, that's another story. Now, I will say, though, that if someone has no formal experience in something, that doesn't mean that they have no experience in something. And so people often do confuse those two and say, oh, well, this person doesn't have formal experience in this job, therefore they couldn't possibly be good at it. But they may actually be good at it. They may have experience with several of the different elements required for that particular position, and they may actually be qualified regardless of what would normally be looked at as their qualifications. But that, I think, has more to do with perceptions as to what makes someone qualified than it necessarily has to do with an ad hominem attack. Although, again, like I said, depending on how someone does it, it could be an ad hominem attack. So, anyway, I was just thinking about that some more, so I wanted to go back to that. Are there any other comments or questions on this issue? Okay, well, I'm not hearing any comments or questions, and I think that we should stop there as far as the logical fallacies for tonight, and perhaps that'll be it. It may be the case that we don't end up going through more logical fallacies together on the calls. We've gone through quite a lot that I think you guys should have the idea of what logical fallacies are and the way of thinking involved in evaluating logical fallacies and recognizing them. And I know that some of you guys have been looking into this more than just what we've gone through on the meetings, which is excellent. Earlier in this series of discussions, I mentioned formal fallacies, like everything we've gone through has been informal fallacies, but then there's a whole other category of logical fallacies called formal fallacies, which is where the actual structure of the argument is not valid. And I encourage you guys to look into that. We may not go into that on the calls together, but I think it's important to understand the various types of logical fallacies and cognitive biases and so on. So, yeah, everyone, you're all encouraged to learn more about logical fallacies, cognitive biases, and critical thinking in general. So we need to all do this, and then we can help each other, because we all still have the capability to think fallaciously. And hey, if we catch each other committing logical fallacies in these meetings, we should be able to freely say, hey, sorry, that was this fallacy. Now, again, I'm talking about this amongst ourselves. As I've said on previous calls, it's not the best idea in the vast majority of instances to say to someone, you just committed this fallacy, to point it out to them and list the fallacy and all of that. But among us, we are aware of these things now, and we shouldn't be offended with someone correcting us if we do commit a fallacy. And so feel free to do so. Or even if you're not sure if someone has committed a fallacy on the call, but you think they may have, maybe you could mention it to them, like, hey, I'm not totally sure, but that seemed like it was a logical fallacy, and maybe it was this one. And then we can discuss it and see whether it was a fallacy. And we should all learn to be okay with being corrected, because this is how we will learn to think correctly, and we can all help each other in love through this process. So, with all that said, would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will. Dear Heavenly Family, we just thank you for tonight, and we just pray that these logical fallacies, that they stay with our minds, and that we're watching for them in our everyday life. And we also pray that we're able to accept correction, especially from each other, and in the light that it's given, and understand that it's for all of our benefit. And we just thank you so much for your truths, and we just pray for a burning desire in each of our minds to want to study more, to get to know you better, to get to know your character, and to want to have your character. We pray for all these things in the name of the branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
So, Lila Tov, everyone. Love you all.
Lila Tov.